I started dealing with two unusual, very bizarre cases, and I had a girlfriend at the time who was one of my investigators dealing with abductions. It was good having her with us because a lot of the abductees are female, and with some of the more personal aspects of abductions, they wanted to share them, but felt uncomfortable sharing them with a man. She was a Christian, and I was fine with that. She didn't push it on me in any way. But she pulled me aside one day and said, "There's something very dark going on with these two cases, and I think you need some protection." She handed me a Bible and said, "It's in here." I replied, "No, it's got nothing to do with that." But I took a look at it, and when I read what's called the gospel message, I chose to become a Christian. And what Joe did as time went on, he began to look at it from this perspective, and he uncovered a number of cases where people claimed that they'd been literally able to stop an alien abduction in mid-process by calling out the name of Jesus or the Christian God, and that the entities had vanished, that it was almost as if they'd been, hit by an electric shock or something like that, or shot. They just staggered away into the darkness, and the alien abduction experience came to a close. Now, this wasn't, when they're in sort of like on a UFO situation. This was primarily sort of in the bedroom when the experiences began or ending, and these creatures are looming around the bed, and they would sort of cry out, "Help me, God," or whatever, and these creatures would then sort of disappear into the darkness and be gone, literally gone. And so Joe set up a website where he now collects and publishes. Literally, he's got hundreds of cases of this occurring. Now, people say, well, is it possible that that's exactly what's going on, by calling out Jesus' name, that it does literally stop these entities because they are demonic entities? That would make sense. I think one of the things we need to be careful of is whether or not, because some of these experiences seem to occur in altered states, in some fashion at least, could it be if we deeply project like a message of hostility towards them, they would pick up on that anyway? In other words, if you were to cry out for Buddha or Allah or whatever, it may not be the deity or whoever you're calling, it may just be the sheer fact that you're projecting hostility towards them, and they realise you have a way of fighting back, that may actually have an effect as well. And again, I think a lot of it comes down to belief system, that the group was very Christian oriented. They actually didn't, rather ironically, look into sort of too many stories of demonic legends and tales as they're related to other religions. They did from the perspective of looking at crossovers, but not from the perspective of trying to understand it from those teachings. So, we have this situation where, although Joe's obviously not part of this group or this think tank, he's just an independent abduction researcher, he came to a similar conclusion as well, that abduction seems to be tied in with this phenomenon. Now, that's of course President Ronald Reagan. What we know is in the early 1980s, specifically in 1982, when Steven Spielberg released E.T., prior to it going on mainstream release in cinemas all around the world, President Reagan and the staff of the White House were given a private viewing at the White House. A lot of people don't know it's actually a cinema in the White House, and they often show films. And of course, Reagan, before he became president, was an actor, and he obviously retained his interest in the Hollywood film industry. And Steven Spielberg was basically invited to show E.T. at the White House. And there was Reagan, his wife Nancy, and Spielberg, his wife, and various high-ranking people in the White House. And there's a story within the UFO subject that Reagan supposedly leaned over to Spielberg and said, there's only so many people in the room who know how true the basic story behind E.T. really is. That apparently the idea was that Spielberg actually got some of the details quite close to the real truth. Now, one of the interesting things, although we're not able to verify that, obviously Reagan's dead and Spielberg actually won't comment on it. He won't deny it, but he won't comment on it. What we can verify is that the next day, the very next day, literally 24 hours after watching E.T., because the files have now been declassified, Reagan got a classified briefing on the current state of the US space program. Now, you would imagine that would be done by people from NASA, because they're handling space flights, but it wasn't. It was actually done by representatives of the National Security Council. So you have to wonder, what was it about the whole space program that was ensuring that a presidential briefing on the subject isn't being done by the people sending the rockets and the space shuttles up. It's actually being done by the NSC, the National Security Council. Now, that's verifiable. What we don't have is the actual body of the briefing. We know it went ahead because the file's saying, diary entries in the White House saying briefing for the President tomorrow, National Security Council, space program. They've been released. Exactly what was spoken about in the meeting, that hasn't. But what we also know is that it was from this time onwards that Reagan, after getting his briefing, began to develop an even deeper interest in UFOs. And the Reagan administration sponsored, it now seems to be the case, a number of people have come forward to support this, sort of like a clandestine study of abduction stories. And they commissioned 3 reports, one from this particular think tank that concluded it was demons, another one from the CIA who concluded it could very well be extraterrestrial, and another one was an Air Force psychologist who thought it was just all in the mind, bad dreams and folklore combining, etc. And again, one of the reasons why this seems to be the case and something to support it is that from about 1985 onwards, when Reagan was giving speeches and lectures, he would allude to, what would happen if the Earth was faced with an outside threat from outer space. It would unite us and unify us. And he mentioned that in, I think, 5 or 6 lectures from the mid to late 80s onwards. And of course, this makes people speculate, why did he have this on his mind so much? Was it relative to this whole issue? And one of the group members told me that the issue that he was most fascinated by was this one, suggesting like a demonic angle to the whole UFO subject. Now, through the Freedom of Information Act, we can actually learn, and we have learned, what books each president has in his White House library. For example, when one president goes out and another family moves in, they take often some of their furniture and possessions, certainly. And your bookshelves you've got at home, just because you're president doesn't mean you throw your books out. They all go into the White House library. And you can actually use the Freedom of Information Act to say, I demand to know what books Bill Clinton had on his shelves, when he was president. And they'll send you a list. Bizarre as it sounds, they will. And Reagan had no end of books on things like end times scenarios, Armageddon, biblical prophecies about war breaking out in the Middle East, and just basic end time scenarios, the final battle between good and evil, and things like this, all of which were sort of related to the views of this particular group, who concluded that UFO sightings, abductions, etc., that it was all building up to some sort of final deception. And if you have the next one, please. That's Michael Heiser. Michael is another person who's looked into the UFO subject, and again, he's written a number of books and maintains several websites and blogs looking into this whole angle of deception. And he has come round to the conclusion that, again, it seems more demonic than it does extraterrestrial. And the next one, please. That's Guy Malone. Guy lives in Roswell, of all places, and he's had an interest in UFOs going back quite a long time, and started off, like most people in the subject, thinking it was extraterrestrial. Alien abductions were literal alien abductions. And he too changed his mind the further he dug into it and came more around to this demonic biblical perspective. And one of the things that both Michael and Guy believe, because of they developed a Christian background, obviously, was that there will be this sort of final confrontation between good and evil one day. That, it will come to pass, and that in some way these entities will actually show themselves, on large scale all around the world, and they'll appear before us, and we'll sort of embrace them as friendly aliens who are going to save us, etc. When it's basically, as the group believes, sort of Satan's minions getting their clutches into the entire world, deceiving them, and then there'll be this reign of darkness, if you like, that'll last for however long Satan's in charge. That's their literal viewpoint on things. Now, of course, just to reiterate again, that's their belief system. But one of the things I mentioned earlier was the whole issue of Roswell. And they had some weird and intriguing views on Roswell, which I'll talk about now. If we go on to the next one. That's an ancient painting done hundreds of years ago, back in the, I think the 1800s, but it actually relates to an event from the 1600s. That sort of smoky looking thing on the left hand side is known as a golem, which is a creature from Jewish law. The idea is you can use sort of inanimate matter to give life using, I guess, like ancient rites and rituals. You literally give life to inanimate matter in the form of an entity. Now, why the group concluded that this was relative to Roswell, I'll tell you. As I said, this is perhaps one of the few groups within governments that publicly says something anomalous and strange really did happen at Roswell. You ask most government agencies, they say it was a weather balloon, or it was a spy balloon, or it was whatever. It was anything but a UFO. But the group concludes, as I said, that something strange happened, but they don't think an alien spacecraft and bodies literally crashed to Earth. This actually goes back to what Ray Boucher was told. He was told that the conclusion of the group was that all this, if you know the Roswell story, where the rancher went out in Roswell, New Mexico, to tend the cattle, etc., and came across the Foster Ranch where he worked, this huge field of like metallic foil, this strange debris that was laid around everywhere. It was sort of very, very light, but very, very strong. It could be curled up and then it would spring back to its original shape. So certainly nothing like what we had. And of course, it gave all the indications that something had slammed into the ground in a crash. And there were reports also of strange bodies having been found in the area as well. What the group came to conclude was that, and again, this is a belief-driven conclusion, I would stress, was that the debris, the wreckage, wasn't anything that had ever crashed. They concluded that these entities had somehow literally sort of plucked matter from somewhere else, and using ancient alchemy, which is where you train, you allegedly at least change one substance into another, sort of talking about turning tin into gold or whatever, using alchemical methods. They created this material, wreckage, and just carefully placed it on the ground. And as far as the bodies were concerned, they believed that they were, I'm sure everybody knows what a jackalope is, the idea of, it's like you see at fairs and circuses where they're like a little constructed body made out of real flesh, blood and bones, but they never lived. They're just like parts put together. You might have like a rabbit with deer horns coming out of his head. That's a classic jackalope that you see. And that's in simple terms. But what the group concluded was that these entities had the ability to literally manipulate DNA as a genetic level in ways that we just didn't understand, but that they created these bodies with a view to having us believe they were extraterrestrial corpses, but in reality they were like highly advanced genetic dolls that never ever lived. But again, the idea was to lay the wreckage out, lay the bodies out, to deceive us into the idea that vulnerable aliens had crashed on the Earth. And again, another reason they came to this conclusion was that the guy who was doing that ritual there in the 1600s, this is an old story, was actually a distant relative of a man named Theodore von Karman. Theodore von Karman was a very noted rocket scientist in the 50s and 60s who worked with NASA. And Theodore von Karman worked closely with Jack Parsons, who was a follower of Aleister Crowley again. So, they were making all these links. Was it only coincidence that Jack Parsons, who actually considered Theodore von Karman to be like a father figure, was it only coincidence that one of Theodore von Karman's relatives, or in the past, had tried to conjure up a manufactured life form? And again, that was one of the things that led them to this particular conclusion. And also, on the day he died, Jack Parsons, he blew himself up in his lab in Pasadena, California. But on the day he died, he was engaging in some weird ancient ritual to try and create a creature known as a homunculus. And if you look up what a homunculus is, it's basically a little man endowed with special powers. That's literally the dictionary description. So in other words, he was trying to create this little being, which if you see the carving or drawing of it, again, it's like a little creature about this high, with a large bald head. And again, so they were putting pieces together and trying to make some conclusion, but doing so from the perspective that they had a lot of them had sort of deep religious and Christian backgrounds. Now, of course, the big question is, are they right, or were they coloured and biased because of their belief systems, even if they weren't trying deliberately to be so? And I think that's a difficult question to answer. I think we all try and remain impartial when we're investigating UFO sightings, but when we're still looking for the definitive answer, belief systems inevitably creep into the picture. It's like people say, well, I believe Kennedy was shot by one gunman. No, I believe he was shot by two. We believe it because we don't have the proof, and so we develop theories and hypotheses that then, as much as we don't want to do it, we do have to an extent, go down that belief-driven path, if you like. So that essentially is the story behind the group, and as to the way in which they formed and the ideas and beliefs that they reached. Now, of course, as I said, much of it is belief-driven. What I think is important, however, is the fact that this was a group within the Pentagon that received quite deep funding, and we know the reason why they got the funding was because there were people above them who also supported this particular view. And there are a few strands of the story where we know the group had access to information and data that the public doesn't have access to. I mean, for a lot of their stuff, rather ironically, although they're a government think tank, they were analysing things like George Adamski's books, or Alan Hynek's books, or ancient texts on demonology from Babylonia, and things like this. So a lot of it was actually open source literature that they were reviewing. And that's often what think tanks do. They just look at what's being published and go through it all and see what it supports or what it doesn't support. But there are several references in some of the files that we've now got hold of where they talk about research undertaken at Wright-Patterson Air Force Base in the Foreign Technology Division, where they talk about something strange which they call the Parsons technique, which obviously has to have a connection with Jack Parsons, where it says that scientists using the Parsons technique at Wright-Patterson spontaneously conjured up debris similar to the Roswell materials. It just literally appeared in the lab for like a second or two and then blinked out and was gone. Nobody knew what it was or where it came from or went to. But the story was that it wasn't like they made this in some sort of highly advanced machine. They were talking about guys literally putting their minds in altered states and focusing on some phenomena, and then this thing just flitting in and out, and then it was gone again. So now, if that's true, then that's sort of pretty strange. If it's disinformation, as some people think it could be, ironically, it could be disinformation to confuse the fact that literal aliens really did crash in Roswell. We just don't know. It's very much a hall of mirrors, and that's why really I've sort of left my views out of the book, because and just let the story and the people tell it as it is, because when we're dealing with something like this, which is very much belief driven and we don't have the hard and fast answers, it's not just hall of mirrors, it's even within the government. Department A doesn't always know what Department B knows, and they don't even know Department C exists or what Department D is doing. They keep secrets from each other, and they deceive each other on certain occasions as well. There's actually one famous story, nothing to do with UFOs, but one I've been researching, where the FBI filed a report with a person in the CIA and deliberately created a totally fake story, because it turned out that somebody within the CIA who was sort of a second in command to this one particular person was working for the Russians, and they wanted the person to see the document. But it was full of fake information, so when this person would then give it to the Russians, it wouldn't be of any help to them. It would actually confuse them and push them down the wrong pathway. So, in other words, when it suits them, agencies lie to each other if it's going to help protect a particular secret or that they want keeping. And so that could be the case. I don't deny that with this story. This whole scenario of demonic UFOs could be a masquerade to hide the fact that it's really alien, or it could be something to hide a completely different scenario. We just don't know, and that's, as I said, why I think it's important just to tell the story, and hopefully you know, it may bring other people out of the woodwork, but it actually has. There's a researcher named Phil Imbrogno who's written a number of books, you might have heard of him. He's got a new book coming out next year, which is all about ancient entities from the past known as jinns, that I'm sure some of you have heard of. It's where the term genie comes from. Jinns are sort of like negative entities from ancient cultures going back thousands of years. And he's uncovered information where some group in the military was trying to literally capture the essence of a jinn, which sounds similar to some of the areas with demons that this group was focused on. Now, of course, you know, what I also tell people is that government agencies often fund organisations with strange ideas. Doesn't mean it's true, or it's real or feasible. I mean, I'll give you another example, and you'll understand what I mean by bringing this up. I used the Freedom of Information Act about 2 years ago and got hold of some files how in the mid-1950s the US Army had spent, I think, something like $9,000 across the course of 2 weeks to basically bring up several German Shepherd dogs into one particular lab, determine if German Shepherds or dogs in general possessed ESP. And if they did possess ESP, if they could be trained to use mind powers to locate landmines in battlefield scenarios. Now, you know, that sounds strange, the idea of a government think tank looking to see if German Shepherds, you know, could use their powers of the mind to find landmines. But those files have now all been officially declassified. So it does demonstrate the important thing that there are a lot of weird things out there that government agencies will fund. Now, in this case, you know, the dogs just ran around and drinking water and eating the dinner and wagging the tail, having a good time. You know, they didn't find any fake. They actually laid down fake or real landmines that they didn't have the explosives in them, and they didn't find them. You know, the project was scrapped. And you could argue that this is a similar situation where you had a group that was actually given funding, came to a conclusion, somebody in government said, "Oh, very, very interesting, but you know, no, we think it's alien. Thank you for all your work, and we'll close it down now." It could be that scenario. You know, I don't know. As I said, it is the strangest story I've ever sort of investigated or delved into. And where it'll go, I don't know. I mean, Ray Boucher was given the story, as I said, 20 years ago, and he speculates today that he was given the story because these people wanted someone to get the story out. Ray just basically briefly mentioned it here and there and didn't do anything with it. Now, in my book, yeah, the story's out, but